Joe, you have been working for some time on residential land price indices in China, along with Tsinghua University and the National University of Singapore. You have an update of that. So what is the most recent update of your land price index show?
The most recent update is for the fourth quarter of 2014. So we're actually able to produce three new sets of results. One is for the 35-city aggregate index, and the index itself is described on my website and Tsinghua's and the National University of Singapore's. What that shows is a recovery in Chinese land markets for these 35 major cities. The fourth quarter index was up 11% in real terms, that's constant yuan. That more than reversed a 7%, 6 to 7% drop the previous quarter. For calendar year 14, aggregate land prices in those major cities were up just over 7%. And over the 11 years for which we have data, they're rising at a compound 15.2% annual rate. So there's been a lot of real land price growth in China. The second point that I'd like to emphasize, though, is that while prices rebounded, quantities did not. They are way down. In other words, the number of land parcel sales from these 35 city governments to private developers in China remains very low. The fourth quarter data for 2014 was 44% below the same quarter in 2013, and it's 60% below 2 years ago. So what we see is a stark drop in quantities, and that's something we might want to discuss later because at least when we look at other countries' housing and land markets, changes in quantities lead changes in prices, but we can discuss that a little later. The other nice thing about an end-of-the-year update is we have sub-indexes for regions that we report every 6 months and for 12 major cities that we report once a year, and that's in the fourth quarter. So the regional data, we're starting to see some variation across regions. The East region, which contains Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, the East Coast markets, are doing very, very well. They're up 4% in the second half of the year, 6% in the first, so they're going strong. The West region countries, and in China, the three major regions are East, West, and Middle. The West is down 3% in the second half. It was down 12% overall for the year. So you're starting to see some markets well off the coast in China start to deteriorate in price terms, and the Middle region is in between those two guys. Now, I think the most interesting results are for the 12 cities. We only report them once a year because only over a 12-month period do we have enough land price sales to estimate our index in what we think is a credible way. Beijing, as usual, I think is the most amazing city I study anywhere in the world. Land prices, real, in Beijing were up 54% in 2014. And by the way, they were up 47% in 2013. And over the 11 years of our data, they're up 1,036%. That works out to a 27.5% compound annual real appreciation rate in land. That's Beijing. There's nothing like it in China or, as far as I can tell, anywhere else in the world. Although other East Coast markets, Shanghai, Guangzhou, are up. Shanghai's had two very strong years also in 2013 and 2014. They have a 20.4% compound growth rate over their life in the index. Those markets aside, there are four markets that showed decline. Chongqing, Nanjing, Dalian, and Changsha were all down in 2014. Dalian is down for the second year, and they're 25% off their peak. So again, that's the sign that you're seeing real variation and heterogeneity across markets. And in that sense, China looks a lot like the United States, where it's really a mistake to focus too much on the aggregate national index because they have different markets that have very different fundamentals and follow very different patterns. The rest of the cities, the others in our 12, were pretty much flat. It was only the big East Coast markets that were really appreciating at a continuingly high rate. So that's the update from the fourth quarter.
I'd like to turn to some of the factors that are driving the results that you're getting, but maybe it's best to start with the markets that are doing well in China, the housing markets that are improving. What factors do you think are causing that?
I think it's good old-fashioned supply and demand. So when you look at Beijing, there is tremendous demand to enter the city, to live there. It's the nation's capital. Many businesses want to be there. Many households want to be there. And in other research that I've looked at with my co-authors who I work with on this index, when we count up how much supply has been created, it is less than what we think the population growth in those cities is. So I think one of the reasons you're seeing strong trend growth in the East is you see massive in-migration, not just from other Chinese cities, but from the rural parts of China. And you do not see overbuilding in those markets. In the markets that are starting to decline, particularly in the West, some in the central region, what you're seeing is still strong growth. There is a massive movement of rural households into cities throughout China. But in some of the non-coastal markets, the building rates have been so strong that supply has outpaced demand. So that's one factor, which is it's just good old-fashioned supply and demand fundamentals. The second one is China's growth is slowing. This is an aggregate factor that, again, plays down a little differently in Beijing from, say, Dalian or Chongqing. But the local market fundamentals are just weaker in some places than they are in others. And if the fundamentals weaken in a place which is oversupplied, those are the places you worry about, that you're going to see a more dramatic fall.
So what can we expect to see over the next few quarters?
I think you're going to see more of the same in a broad sense, which is I think you'll see some markets continuing to do quite well, and I think others will deteriorate. And I think more are likely to deteriorate if China's aggregate growth slows. And partly that's for the real estate reasons I talked about, supply and demand. But also, remember, construction activity in China is a big part of their GDP. Not just, they don't break out residential from commercial, but if you include all real estate activities, it's well over 10% of GDP. So if that slows, the Chinese national economy slows. And if the Chinese national economy slows, there are fewer jobs, which means there's fewer reasons for people to move in to these urban areas. So you can get, a self-reinforcing cycle out of this. And I think I think supply and demand in the property markets is at work, and I think slowing growth as China adjusts its own broad economy from largely export-driven to more internal consumption-driven. It just slows in that process.
So even with slowing growth, do you see anything derailing the Beijing train?
I honestly don't know. What I can tell you is I'm of two minds about this. Nothing can grow at 27.5% per year for all that long. And that's what the Beijing land market has been appreciating at. So that can't last. But do I see a collapse? No. Simply because demand is incredibly strong and supply has not been incredibly high. Even with all the building, it's been much less than demand. So it will end. Beijing will not. If you think China's growing at 7.5, Beijing's growing at it is appreciating at roughly 4 times the growth rate of national output. That can't continue, but that's a very different statement from it will crash. Where I worry about problems, which I think is what you're asking about, is in the non-coastal markets, a handful of them, where you see excess supply. If you see a negative demand shock in those markets amidst excess supply, then you could have more serious problems.
In China, how does land get on the market?
Land is owned in urban areas by the local Communist Party government. So if a private developer wants to build a high-rise and sell those units to Chinese citizens, they have to buy the land from the local government. And what they really do is purchase a leasehold estate. For residential use, that can be for up to 70 years. And our land price index is really an index of the leasehold estate purchase prices. And for those who really want to dig into those details, we have a technical white paper on my website where the index data also is, and you can read everything you want to know about exactly what that means.
So when you say that there's a decline in quantities, there's less supply coming on the market, that is less supply being released by the government then?
They sold many fewer parcels this past year than they did in the previous two, which means there must be less supply coming down the road because you need the land to build the high rises.